Airports are supposed to be bustling with life, but at Blackwood International there's a terminal that's always empty. A terminal where the flights never leave and the passengers never arrive. I used to work as a security guard at Blackwood International, an old airport on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet job, mostly patrolling the terminals and checking bags. But one night, everything changed. It started with the sounds footsteps in empty hallways, whispers in vacant gates. I told myself it was just the wind, the pipes creaking. But then I saw them, passengers, dozens of them, wandering the terminal in outdated clothing, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. I tried to speak to them, but they didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, like they were looking through me. I called my supervisor, but when he arrived, the passengers were gone. "You're just tired," he said. "Get some rest." But the sightings didn't stop. Every night I'd see them passengers, flight attendants, even pilots, all wandering the terminal, all silent, all staring. One night I decided to follow them. I trailed a group of passengers down a long dark hallway, the lights flickering overhead. They led me to an old terminal, one that had been closed for years. The door was locked, but the passengers walked right through it. I hesitated, then used my keycard to open the door. What I saw still haunts me to this day. The terminal was filled with gates, each one occupied by a plane. But they weren't real. Their bodies were twisted, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and fear. And standing over them were the flight attendants, their faces hidden behind masks, their hands stained with blood. I ran, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I quit my job the next day, but I couldn't escape the memories. Sometimes, late at night, I hear those footsteps again, and I know the terminal is still open. Pilots are supposed to fly planes. But at Mercy International, there's a pilot who crashes them, and he's still flying. I was a flight attendant doing my training at Mercy International, an old airport with a reputation for strange occurrences. But I didn't believe in ghosts until I met Captain Blackwood. He was a legend among the staff, a brilliant pilot who had worked at the airport decades ago. But there was something off about him. His eyes were cold, his smile too wide, and his hands were always stained with blood. I first saw him in the cockpit, standing over the controls, his face hidden behind a mask. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another flight. But then I noticed something strange. The plane wasn't moving. I approached the cockpit, my heart pounding, and checked the controls. There was no power. "What are you doing?" Captain Blackwood asked, his voice low and guttural. I turned to him, but he was gone. The cockpit was empty, the lights flickering, the only sound the hum of the engines. I told the other flight attendants what I'd seen, but they just shook their heads. "Captain Blackwood died years ago," one of them said. "You must be mistaken." But I wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I saw him again and again in the cockpit, in the terminal, even in the hangar. And every time there was a plane that didn't make it. One night, I decided to confront him. I followed him down a long, dark hallway, the lights flickering overhead. He led me to an old hangar, one that had been closed for years. The door was locked, but Captain Blackwood walked right through it. I hesitated, then used my keycard to open the door. What I saw still haunts me to this day. The hangar was filled with planes, each one occupied by a passenger. But they weren't alive. Their bodies were twisted, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and fear. And standing over them was Captain Blackwood, his hands on the controls. I ran, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I quit my training the next day, but I couldn't escape the memories. Sometimes, late at night, I hear those engines roaring, and I know Captain Blackwood is still flying. Have you ever been on a flight and felt like something was off? Like the air was too still, the cabin too quiet, or the other passengers just a little too strange? Well, what I'm about to tell you isn't just a feeling. It's a story that still haunts me every time I step onto a plane. And by the end of it, you might think twice about flying at night too. It was a red-eye flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. I was travelling alone, which wasn't unusual for me. I'd done it a dozen times before. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the ticket agent handed me my boarding pass without a word, or how the gate was eerily empty, even though the flight was supposedly full. Still, I brushed it off. I was tired, and all I wanted was to sleep through the 6-hour flight. The plane itself was strange, older than most I'd been on. The seats were worn, the overhead lights flickered, and there was this faint smell like damp carpet and something metallic. I found my seat near the back, next to the window. The cabin was dimly lit, and most of the passengers were already seated, their faces hidden in the shadows. I remember thinking it was odd how quiet everyone was. No chatter, no laughter, just silence. About an hour into the flight, I started to notice things, little things. The man across the aisle from me hadn't moved an inch since takeoff. He was just staring straight ahead, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The woman in front of me kept tilting her head to the side like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then there were the flight attendants. They'd walk by every so often, but they never offered drinks or snacks. They just stared. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too blank. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and overthinking things. But then the turbulence started. It wasn't normal turbulence. It was violent, like the plane was being shaken by some unseen force. The overhead bins rattled and the lights flickered on and off. And then I heard it, a voice. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the seat behind me. It was a child's voice whispering the same phrase over and over. "We're not supposed to be here." My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The seat behind me was empty, completely empty. But the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from all around me now, echoing through the cabin. "We're not supposed to be here." I looked around the cabin, and that's when I realised the other passengers weren't reacting. They weren't scared. They weren't even moving. They just sat there, staring straight ahead, their faces pale and lifeless. And then it hit me. This wasn't a normal flight. This wasn't a normal plane. I don't know how I didn't see it before. The flickering lights, the silence, the strange smell. We weren't in the air anymore. We hadn't been for a long time. The plane lurched violently and the overhead lights went out. In the darkness, I could hear the whispering again, louder now, more urgent. We're not supposed to be here. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some kind of light. When I turned it on, I wished I hadn't. The cabin was different. The seats were torn, the windows cracked, and the passengers, they weren't people anymore. They were something else. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow. I don't know how I got out of there. I don't even remember landing. All I know is that when I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. The nurses told me they found me wandering near the airport, delirious and covered in scratches. They said my flight had been cancelled hours before I even arrived at the airport. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or something worse? All I know is that I'll never fly again. And if you ever find yourself on a red-eye flight and something feels off, trust your instincts, because you never know where that plane might really be taking you.